Say, Otto, Frank's going to show Don how to assemble that rear axle they took down. Then he's going to give Don the pitch on how to adjust the gears properly.
Well, Tech, you couldn't have picked a better man. Frank knows a heck of a lot about rear axles.
Sure, but wouldn't it be better for Don to know both ways of doing the job?
Oh, you mean using the new pinion setting gauge?
Right. And since you're using the gauge on that job right now, I'll tell Frank you'll be over later to explain how that gauge works.
Okay, by me. But be sure you let Frank in on it.
Well, there's Frank now. I'll catch up with him and tell him the whole story. And that's why Otto and I thought Don ought to know both assembly stories.
Well, that's a good idea, Tech. I might as well let Don know he's in for a double feature. Don, there are really two ways of doing this job. I'm going to show you one. Then Otto will be over later to show you how to use a new type of gauge for the same job. It makes possible a few shortcuts.
All right, Frank, where do we start?
Well, first we inspect the new parts we're going to put in. Got to be sure they're all in good condition.
Why? They're new, aren't they?
Sure, but sometimes they get banged up in handling. So look the gears over for nicks and burred edges.
These gears in the case look okay to me, Frank.
All right. Before you disassemble the carrier, did you check the differential case for runout?
Yep. I put the case in the carrier and used the indicator. I also checked the bolt hose for being out of round.
Okay. Let's put the differential gears in the case and install the ring gear. And tighten these nuts about 35 to 40 foot-pounds and bend the locks up. Then install the differential bearings using this driver to protect the bearings.
Okay, what next?
Well, you got to follow a definite sequence of 4 main steps if you want to set the gears up properly for quiet operation and long life. First, of course, is getting the right pinion bearing preload.
I remember. That means finding the right number of shims.
Right. And then we got to get the right pinion setting for proper mesh with the ring gear. Now, that means finding the right size washer to put behind the pinion. Third, we got to preload the differential bearings to keep the ring gear from moving sideways. And last, we got to get the right backlash between the ring gear and pinion so the teeth will be properly lubricated and won't score.
Hey, that doesn't sound so easy.
Relax, Don. Frank will be glad to give you the pitch.
Yeah, here's what you do. Take the adjusting washer used before and slide it on the pinion shaft, chamfer side down. Notice that the chamfer fits over the slight radius behind the pinion. This washer, by the way, controls the depth of the pinion mesh with the ring gear.
Okay, now what comes after the washer?
The new bearing, of course. Squirt on some oil, then press the bearing on the shaft, slip on the spacer, and put the pinion in the carrier. After that, put on the bearing adjuster shims, oil and slide on the new front bearing, and install the flange and nut. And now we're ready to preload the pinion bearings.
You better explain that, Frank.
Well, Don, you know that the bearing cups seat against thrust shoulders inside the carrier. And you also know that the cone and roller assemblies are tapered so they can be drawn into the cups like wedges. So think of the pinion and flange nut as a bolt and nut through the cones. The more you tighten the nut, the tighter you draw the cones into the cups.
Oh, I see. And I suppose you could even draw the cones in so tight the bearings would burn up under load.
Sure. That's why the spacer's put in between the cones. But the spacer has to be adjustable due to slight variations in carrier machining and in bearing thickness. So you use shims to make the spacer longer or shorter. Then, when you draw the cones into the cups, they'll go just so far. The spacer and shims keep them from wedging into the cups too tightly.
But they can't be loose, right?
Right. Loose bearings will pound to pieces and fail. And they'll let the pinion walk back and forth, changing the tooth contact pattern. This scores gears and causes noise. So, you got to read a torque of 15 to 25 inch-pounds to be sure you've got the proper preload. If there's only 10 inch-pounds, that means there are too many shims. Now, in that case, you take out shims to bring the cones into the cups a little tighter. On the other hand, you'd add shims to lengthen the spacer whenever you read more than 25 inch-pounds. Now, to get on with the job, hold the flange with this special wrench and tighten the nut to at least 175 foot-pounds. Then, with a speed wrench, spin the pinion shaft to position the...
Drag puts a slight drag on the shaft and throws your torque reading off.
When the preload's okay, and later when you know the tooth pattern is all right, then you install the... Now, we're ready to preload the differential bearings and get the right backlash.
Well, what are we waiting for?
Okay, Mr. Needles. So, let's put in the case and ring gear, bearing caps and bolts, and match up the punch marks.
Before you go any farther, Frank, you better check the ring gear for runout.
That's right, Tech. You see, Don, it's got to be true within 5 thousandths. This one's okay. Now, screw out the adjuster at the back face of the ring gear and screw in the other adjuster until there's plenty of backlash. Then you tighten these lower cap screws 85 to 90 foot-pounds and leave the top screws loose. Now, screw out the adjuster on the tooth side and screw in the other adjuster until there's only a little backlash.
You do that, Don, to line up the bearing cups for the final bearing preload and gear backlash adjustment.
Right. Now, with a dial gauge, find the point of least backlash on the ring gear.
What's so important about that?
You gotta find the point of least backlash so the gears won't be too tight at any one spot when you finish.
Find that point, Don. Screw in the back face adjuster until you read 1/1000th backlash. Now we're ready to kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
What do you mean?
Well, we get the proper backlash and end up with the proper bearing preload just by turning in the adjuster on the tooth side until the dial gauge shows 6/1000th backlash. When you turn these adjusters, remember to stop them so the locks will fit in the holes. Then, tighten up both top cap screws 85 to 90 foot-pounds.
And don't forget to check the backlash again.
Oh, yeah, Don. If the check shows that the backlash is changed after you tighten the caps, loosen the top cap screws and wrap the bearing caps with a soft hammer. Then, retighten the screws and check backlash again.
Well, according to the gauge, we've got the 6/1000ths backlash we want, Frank. Is that all there is to it?
Well, Ned lead, and find out how good a tooth contact you've got. But before we do that, let's take a look at these pictures of gear tooth contact patterns while somebody turns the record over.
Don, this reference book will show you the kind of tooth contact marking we're shooting for. Notice that it's well centered on both the drive and coast sides, about a 1/16th from the tooth edges. Now, this is the way it's going to look when you apply load and turn the gears by hand. Under an actual operating load, this is how it will look. The contact area will be slightly larger.
Oh, I see. But now, what kind of tooth marks are bad?
Well, if the contact is narrow and high on both sides of the tooth face, the tooth will gall. This would give you wear and noise. So you'd have to move the pinion toward the center of the ring gear by installing a thicker washer behind the pinion.
Tell Don what to do to correct a heavy flank contact.
Okay, that type of contact, Don, also galls the teeth, causing noise. So you'd have to move the pinion away from the ring gear by using a thinner washer behind the pinion. Now here's something else. When contact is too heavy on the toe of the tooth, the edges might chip and wear due to terrific pressure on the small area. Now to correct this, move the ring gear away from the pinion. And if that gives you more than 10/1000ths backlash, put a thicker washer behind the pinion.
Well, do you do just the opposite to correct a heavy heel contact?
Yeah, in that case, you'd have to move the ring gear toward the pinion. But if this makes the backlash too tight, move the pinion a little away from the ring gear by inserting a thinner washer behind the pinion.
I think I understand, Frank. But I sure hope I'll remember all that.
You got it right here in the reference book, Don. Add a little experience, and it'll be a cinch. Just don't forget, the whole thing boils down to good tooth contact. Don't ever be satisfied with a contact pattern that just comes close.
Well, let's paint these gears and see what we get.
Looks right on the button, my boy. And we got it the very first try.
Nice going, fellas. That's a mighty good pattern. Now you can put that new oil seal in.
Yeah, Tech. I've already broken the preservative coating and soaked the seal in this pan of oil. Don, you always do that before you install a new pinion oil seal.
Hi, gang. How's that axle coming?
Okay, Otto. We're ready to wrap it up.
What? You mean you got a good tooth contact the first time?
Sure. See what a little experience can do? Of course, I'll admit every now and then I don't get a good tooth contact on the first try, but neither does anybody else.
Well, that's right, Frank. Let's show Don how to use this gauge now, okay?
Sure, go right ahead.
Well, this gauge is just the thing for those every now and then jobs, Don. It'll be a big help to you. So let's take this setup apart. Then I'll show you just how the gauge is applied to the same job you and Frank did. First, I'm going to set the preload on the bearings like you did. Instead of using the new pinion, however, I'm going to use the main body of this gauge. It takes the place of the pinion. You notice I don't have to press on the rear bearing. It slides on easily. And I'm not using the adjusting washer behind the pinion. Don't know what size to use yet. So I slide on the spacer and slip the gauge into the carrier. Then I add bearing adjusting shims and the front bearing.
So far, it's almost identical to what we did, Don.
Right. There really aren't many differences. Now I put on this compression sleeve, the centralizing washer, and the compression nut. Then I tighten the nut to 175 foot-pounds and spin the gauge to line up the bearing rollers, just as you did when you had the pinion in there. Then read the inch-pounds torque. Let's see. Only 10 pounds. Got to subtract shims. Well, there's 20 inch-pounds. How's that check with your setting?
Right on the nose, Otto. So far, you and Frank got the same answers.
Okay. Now the next step is to find what size washer we need to put the pinion in the right position. And that's where this gauge really pays off.
Well, do you start out with the old washer like we did?
Nope. I'm going to check the size I need, then I'll be right the first time. First, I add this block to the gauge. That takes the place of the drive pinion. Then I'll put this tube in the bearing supports and run the cap screws down just snug. Now the space between the gauge block and the tube is the washer thickness I need. So I slide a washer through there. When I find one that fits with just a slight drag, that's the size washer I need.
Incidentally, Don, those washers come in 6 thicknesses, in steps of 2 thousandths, from 84 to 94 thousandths.
Now this washer is 90 thousandths, and it'll go through. The next thicker size won't go through. So 90 thousandths is our baby.
But, Otto, that's not the one.
Leave him alone, Don. He'll come up with the right answer.
Right, my boy, I'm not through yet. I noticed that this new pinion has a -2 etched on the end. That means the pinion should be set 2 thousandths of an inch deeper into the ring gear.
I wondered what that meant.
Well, Don, when these gears are first mated, the pinion is set a certain distance from the center of the ring gear. But when they're run in, maybe you get a better tooth contact by shifting the pinion slightly. So the end of the pinion is marked to show what position is best. A minus marking means move the pinion in toward the ring gear. Plus means move the pinion out from the center of the ring gear. And since this pinion is marked -2, we've got to use a washer 2 thousandths thicker than the gauge shows. A 90 thousandths washer slid through between the gauge block and the tube, so we'll use a 92 thousandths washer for this particular gear set.
And that's right, too. That's the size washer we used.
But notice that with this gauge, I'm not guessing. I know it's the right one. And since I know what washer and shims to use, I'll just take the parts off the gauge, put them on the pinion, put the job together, and get my tooth pattern. There. Take a look at that tooth contact.
Good work, Otto. That's a right sharp-looking set of tooth marks.
Well, Otto, that's a pretty good gauge. You know, it's a good thing that Don knows both ways to do the job. If the gauge was tied up or not available, he'd still be able to adjust the gears.
Yeah, but whichever way you do the job, remember that you still gotta check the tooth contact to be sure the adjustment is right.
Oh, sure, that goes without saying.
Well, Don, let's get this axle back in the car. And be sure to use new seals and gaskets.
And don't forget to check the axle shaft end play before you mount the wheels and bleed the brakes.
Right, and Don, 3 to 8 thousandths total end play is what you're after. The adjusting procedure's in the reference book.
Well, Don, You sure got the complete story on how to set up an axle. You ought to be an expert now.
Well, I don't know about that expert part, but I certainly know a lot more about how gears ought to be set up.
That's really all it takes, fellas. A little know-how, some careful workmanship, and you've got yourself a bunch of satisfied service customers.